Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Very excited. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, I am Dr. Joy Harden Bradford. I am a licensed psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia, and also the founder of Therapy for Black Girls. And Therapy for Black Girls is a community really designed to focus on the mental health and wellness needs of Black women and girls. And so that is inclusive of a therapist directory that has over 1,800 therapists across the country and in Canada who love doing great clinical work with Black women and girls. We also have a weekly podcast where we tackle lots and lots of different topics related to Black women and girls, again, in mental health and wellness, as well as a very active and engaged social media community. So I see lots of you who have joined us today. So I'm very excited to be here again with you all today. So today we are going to be talking about finding grace in difficult situations. And so we know that if there is anything that 2020 has taught us, it is that we do not have nearly as much control as we thought we might have had. And so we know that we cannot control lots of things in our lives, but in a lot of ways, we can control the ways that we respond to them. And so when we're thinking about all of the multiple stressors that we may have experienced in the past couple of months, we do really want to think about how we can respond to both others and ourselves with grace and kindness, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So just to think through, not that anybody necessarily needs this list, but I think sometimes it can be really helpful to list out on paper all of the multiple things that might be going on in your life at any one moment. So it's really hard to take an assessment and to get a clear picture of how much stress we are under if we sometimes don't see it on paper. So when we think about the past couple of months, we know that many of us have been struggling with multiple different kinds of stresses related to COVID-19. So how can I keep myself safe? How can I keep my family safe? What does this mean in terms of my job may be shutting down, like multiple different things related to COVID-19. We know that we have continued to struggle with racism on both very small and large levels. There have been lots of concerns related to police brutality and the ways that police systems are interacting with our communities. Microaggressions are things that have not ever gone away, really. And so I think in a lot of ways, some microaggressions have maybe been minimized now that more people are working from home. But even in the virtual and digital communities, we still know that microaggressions exist. And so in small ways, microaggressions may not seem like that big of a deal. But when you add them up, when you think about all of the daily microaggressions someone might experience, it can really become a huge cumulative stressor. So microaggressions are important to pay attention to. Parenting, I'm not sure about anyone else, but I have two little ones. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so I know that parenting has been a huge stressor, just thinking about, their educational goals. They have been home since March. And so what does it look like for me to try to manage work while also helping them to get a little bit of education? Of course, not that I am a teacher, and so I will not at all be as great as their teachers in school were, but still trying to meet their emotional and educational needs. So there's just been lots of stresses related to school and parenting and all that comes with that in the past couple of months. Job security. So we know, again, there have been huge economic impact related to everything that's been going on in the past couple of months. And so maybe we were very secure in a job and maybe that doesn't feel as secure right now. So there's a lot of things up in the air just in terms of economics. And then relationships. So we know that a part of what has happened, specifically related to COVID-19, is that we have not been able to engage with our support systems in the same way. And so what does that do to our relationships? Is there now a strain on our relationships? Likewise, we have now maybe been sheltering in place with either a partner or roommates or other people in ways that we were not before, right? So we might have been used to kind of seeing people for a couple of hours a day, or kind of being with each other on the weekdays, and then in the weekends we kind of went our separate ways. And now all of that has been upended, right? And so there may be a little more tension, a little more stress on relationships. And so all of those things, again, when we list them out and we really look at the cumulative amount of stress that we have been under for the past couple of months, it is no surprise why a lot of us may be a little crispy around the edges, so to speak, because there have been lots of different things going on. So in short, if your life feels like this meme right now, our little dog friend who you see is kind of in the middle of a burning room, just sipping their coffee like, this is fine, we will all be fine, right? It quite literally sometimes feels like that is what our world feels like right now, is that we are just kind of in the middle, willing everything to be okay while multiple things around us kind of fall apart. And so I use this meme to kind of illustrate that if you feel like this, you are not at all alone in these feelings. Many of us feel like this. Even if you have not struggled with all of the things that I've shared on the list before, it's very likely that you've struggled with some of the things. And so you are not alone in your struggles. And so again, today we are going to be talking about, even in the midst of all of these things going on, how can we still do a really good job as well as we can, because that's what grace is about, in terms of offering ourselves grace and also other people. So one of the main ways, and this is just a concept that I have just been so pleased to be introduced to, one of the main ways that we can really talk about and work on extending grace to ourselves is through something called self-compassion. And so self-compassion is a concept that was developed by Dr. Kristen Neff. And what it really refers to is us being as kind and gentle to ourselves as we are to the other people that we love in our lives. And so when we think about the level of gentleness and the level of consideration that we offer to other people, we also need to think about how we can do a better job of offering that to ourselves. So it encourages us to consider how we might be as kind and gentle with ourselves as the others that we love. And I know, a lot of us come from lots of different backgrounds. And so, when you think about being really kind and gentle with other people, that part tends to come really easy. But for some reasons, and, there can be lots of different reasons, we are not always as kind and gentle with ourselves. And so self-compassion really focuses and encourages us to develop a practice of being as kind and as gentle with ourselves as we are with other people. And so one of the best ways to really start looking at how you might be able to practice more self-compassion in your life is to think about pretending as if you're talking to a friend. So let's say, for example, the past couple of months, you've been really disappointed with the level of productivity you've had. So I've seen lots and lots of conversations about this in our community, online, and lots of different places. People just have really been kind of surprised by the level of productivity they've had. They've expected to maybe be able to do more and have now realized that they are not as productive as they thought they might be. So if this is something that you're struggling with, I want you to think about, if a friend came to you and said, I'm feeling really disappointed in the way that I have not been able to be as productive at work or in my parenting or wherever, what kinds of things would you say to your friend about how they're feeling, right? What kind of tone would you take with them? It would likely be one of compassion, one of understanding. What kinds of things would you want them to consider about why their productivity might be impacted right now? And so when we think about how we approach a friend who may be struggling with something very similar, we usually are able to approach them with a level of compassion and kindness that we don't always do the best job of giving to ourselves. So one very easy way to practice self-compassion is to approach any difficulties that you're having, any distressing situations, anything that feels really hard for you in your life, as if you were approaching this situation for a friend. If a friend came to you with these concerns, what kinds of things would you say to them? Another thing that can be really helpful for practicing self-compassion is affirmations. And so when you think about affirmations are really designed to be quick mantras or things that really get to the heart of the matter. They really help you to embrace the human side of who you are, because we know that we are not machines, we are not robots, we are humans with lots and lots of complex feelings and layered thoughts and all of those things. And so affirmations can really help you to dig into the human piece of you and to remind you of that. And so people use affirmations in a lot of different ways. So some people like to repeat them to themselves. Some people like to journal about them. Some people like to write them over and over again. Other people really enjoy decorating their bathroom mirrors with affirmations. So if you're somebody who responds well to affirmation, then I want you to take some time, maybe today after we've wrapped up with the presentation, to think about a couple of different affirmations that might be really helpful for you when you find yourself being really critical. So here are just a few to maybe get you started. So one could be, I've done hard things before and I can do them again. A good reminder of your resilience. And resilience really refers to the idea that we can do difficult things because we know we've done difficult things in the past. I am capable. I am human and perfection is not required. And this moment is tough, but eventually it will pass. And so I think a lot of times when emotions are difficult or when we find ourselves in a really difficult situation, it can feel like that is the only thing that you see, right? And when you're in it, of course, that is all you see. It feels really difficult to kind of see anything else. But it's important to know that even though it feels really difficult in this moment, if you allow it to, eventually it will pass. Something else that can be really, really critical to giving ourselves grace is taming this inner critic. And so anybody who maybe has had some experience with therapy, specifically working with a CBT model, cognitive behavioral therapy, will know that as therapists, we use a lot of examining your negative self-talk. So what kinds of messages are you getting and why are those messages so negative? And for a lot of us, we will know that that a lot of times these messages come from places in our childhood. So the little voice that you hear that tells you you're not good enough, you are always a failure, you're never going to amount to anything. Usually those are messages we've gotten from somewhere else that are now just kind of playing on a tape in our heads. And so one thing that can be really helpful when we're talking about examining and really kind of getting to the root of this negative self-talk is to check your receipts. So do you have evidence to support the critical thought that you are telling yourself? So if we go back to our example of feeling like you're not being productive enough, right? I want you to take pen to paper, and you will hear me kind of say that repeatedly because sometimes it is really critical to go to pen and paper because it allows us to think about information in a different way. And so when you think about the fact that you haven't been as productive, is that really the truth? So when you take your pen and paper, when you get your pen and paper and you think about, okay, are there any instances I have where I actually have been productive? So what about 2 weeks ago when I did all of the things on my to-do list? Or what about when I got that assignment turned in early and I didn't think that I would be able to, right? So thinking about all the evidence that you have that actually goes against the thought that you're having can really help you to kind of break down that critical thought. And it's important to think about the fact that those critical thoughts happen pretty quickly sometimes, right? So it isn't even always something that we can slow down and kind of consider this process. But the more times you practice this, the easier it becomes to slow down some of those critical thoughts. So that's one of the first things that I want you to do. The second thing when we're talking about taming that inner critic is to assess your environment for bait. And what I mean by this is that I want you to take a look in your environment and look at anything that is more likely to kind of pull that inner critical voice out. And for a lot of us, it is social media. So you probably have heard lots and lots of conversation and maybe even in your own lives have a good understanding of just how unhealthy our relationship to social media can be sometimes because there tends to be a lot of comparing, right? We tend to look at somebody's beautifully curated Instagram feed and think that this is what life should be, or this is what parenting should look like. Not at all considering, or at least is not as easy to consider in the moment, that it likely took 100 takes before they got that one picture that they actually shared on Instagram, right? And so when you're looking at your environment to do an assessment of the things that bait that inner critic out of you, I want you to look at whether social media is playing a role in this. And are there certain accounts that you need to unfollow? Do you need to maybe take a little bit of a break from social media right now because it's getting, that critical voice is becoming even louder? Or do you need to maybe take the apps off your phone and then maybe just put them back on your phone on the weekends? I've heard people say that those kinds of things are helpful for them because it can be a really, really difficult thing, right? If you kind of see that, people are always winning these awards and it just feels like people are doing different things in your life that you maybe want to be doing, and it feels like you can't add up to that, then removing yourself from those situations can be really critical. So here's another example. And so I do want to, again, make sure if you have any questions or if any of these situations feel particularly familiar to you, I do want to see you share that in the chat or in the question and answer box. So this example, your 8-year-old has spent the past couple of months playing video games because you didn't have the bandwidth to homeschool and now you're feeling guilty. And so this is something that can come up, and I would imagine has come up for a lot of people, especially in recent months. And so how can we invoke what we know now about self-compassion to really do some breaking down of this, right? So some questions that you might want to ask. Is your child safe, right? Because we know ultimately, even if we don't feel like they are meeting certain milestones and whatever, safety is, of course, important. Do they feel loved and cared for? So I have really appreciated hearing lots of child development specialists and pediatricians and all kinds of people who have an expertise in child development talk about the fact that depending on the child's age, they may not remember much of what's going on right now in terms of the pandemic and, all of the anxiety and that kind of stuff, but they will remember how they felt during this time. And so can you, again, give yourself a little bit of grace about being a gold star parent and a gold star teacher and really focusing on just making sure that your kid feels loved and cared for right now? And the other question, and I think that this is a great question to keep coming back to as we're talking about giving ourselves grace, is did you do the best that you could, right? So we know that our resources in terms of time and energy and bandwidth are not limitless, right? And so especially in the past couple of months, most of us got thrown into this, right? We didn't expect that our lives would change in the ways that it had. And it all happened really, really quickly. And so when you think about the bandwidth that you have for a lot of different things, it may not have been endless, and it likely was not endless, right? And so if you did the best that you could and felt like, okay, I really got to focus on this thing, and so maybe school is not as critical right now, then you did do the best that you could. So you want to, again, give yourself some slack and focus on the fact that you did the best that you could. Another example that might be indicative of maybe something of what maybe some people are feeling. So your plan for sheltering in place was to read more books, get on a regular exercise plan, and do lots of self-reflection. And instead, you stay up way past your bedtime scrolling on Twitter, and your diet consists of lots of Cheetos, right? So I know I am definitely guilty. Not Cheetos is not my thing, but I do love a good snack of Oreos. And so some questions that I would encourage you to ask if this is something that you're struggling with to invoke, again, that self-compassion is, have you ever lived through a pandemic before? Right? So you may have had all these grand ideas about what life might look like because it felt like it slowed down. Maybe you had a little extra time. You didn't, weren't required to be commuting an hour back and forth to the office. And so things felt maybe a little different. So maybe you thought that, again, you would have the bandwidth and emotional resources to be able to do all of these things. But there is no guidebook for a pandemic. We know that. And so, again, you are likely doing the very best that you can in terms of what you can do in this moment. Another question you might want to ask yourself is, were your expectations realistic? So we know that hindsight can be 20/20, right? And so now, kind of looking back on maybe what you thought in April, now you may be able to see that your goals and your expectations about what this time might be like were not realistic. So I think for a lot of people, they maybe did not anticipate, I think a lot of people did not anticipate how long this would continue. We kind of felt like, okay, if we can do this for a little while, then we will be good for the summer. And of course, that is not the reality. And so there have been lots and lots of waves of emotions and differing feelings that have likely come up. And so what you thought might have happened in April may not actually be a match for your reality in July. And that's totally okay. It's okay for us to go back and say, oh, I thought that this was going to happen, and it's actually not. And then I would encourage you to think about, is there one small change that you can make for this week? So when we kind of get into our head about like different routines we want to establish, even though sometimes we know that they are the healthiest and the things that we want to do, it's sometimes really hard to kind of get moving and get going in that direction. And so what happens is that we begin feeling ashamed, and then the shame just kind of spirals on top of itself until we do nothing. And so if this is something that you're still wanting to do, or some semblance or some version of, reading more books and getting healthier is something that you still want to do, then is there one small thing that you can focus on this week? So maybe you will say, okay, I will not have Cheetos every night. Maybe I will have Cheetos 2 nights a week, right? So is there some small thing that you can do that will get you a little bit closer to whatever your goals are? A couple more ideas about what grace actually looks like in practice. And so it can look like praising yourself for the one thing that you did get done instead of focusing on the 8 that didn't get done. And I know it can be really, really easy for us to really just focus on all of the things that are not checked off on our to-do list. But can you actually give yourself a little bit of a perspective and say, wow, I didn't get this done, but I did a really good job on this one thing that I did get done. Just a slight change in perspective. Taking that 15-minute walk when you really want to take a nap can also be an exercise in giving yourself grace. And spending a few minutes laughing at Instagram videos, even though there's laundry to do. There will always be more laundry to do, y'all. I hate to inform you. There's always more laundry to do. And so if you just need a little bit of a break and you haven't chuckled in a while, it's okay to give yourself that break, give yourself some grace, and do a little bit of scrolling. So moving on to what it looks like to extending grace to others. And so when we're thinking about extending grace to other people, we do know that there are a couple of assumptions that we have to be working with. So we have to assume that others are typically acting with good intent. We want to assume that when we know better, we do better. And we want to assume that everyone is, again, just doing the very best that we can. So if we are not collectively coming to other people in our relationships with other people with this set of assumptions, then it can be really hard to extend grace to other people. But when we assume these things, when we assume that people don't typically have malicious intent, when we assume that people maybe didn't know that they were hurting our feelings, when we assume that people are doing the best that we can, or best that they can, then it may be a little easier for us to actually extend grace to other people. However, I do want it to be clear that extending grace does not mean that we are not setting boundaries. Once someone has shown us who they are, it is important for us to believe them. So shout out to the great Maya Angelou, who gave us that quote about believing people the first time when they show us who they are. Because I think sometimes we get into difficult and uncomfortable situations because we don't actually believe people when they show us who they are. And so that is not what extending grace is. Extending grace is not allowing ourselves to be manipulated and, used and abused in situations. Extending grace, again, when we go back to that set of assumptions, we are assuming that there is some reciprocity in the relationship. We're assuming that healthy boundaries have already been set in the relationship. We don't want to use extending grace as a way to avoid difficult conversations or having to really set some boundaries around our time and energy. So let's be mindful of that. So again, extending grace does require us to set boundaries. So we can't extend grace, or it may be really difficult to extend grace if we are resentful, if we have not been getting our needs met, or if our cup is empty. And so we know that if we don't set boundaries, these are a few of the things that can end up happening. So we know that when we don't say no enough, when we overextend ourselves and we are just doing too much in terms of trying to maintain relationships and friendships, we can begin to become resentful. So we feel like people are not pouring into us in the same ways. We feel like nobody is saying yes to our needs in the same ways. Not at all sometimes looking at the fact that we have not actually been assertive about what our needs are. And so in order for us to be able to extend grace to others, we have to sometimes do the work of making sure that we are setting boundaries in our relationships. Extending grace may require you to have some tough conversations. So setting boundaries is important, but it is not always the easiest or most comfortable thing to negotiate. So what might it look like for you to initiate a conversation that you've been avoiding or didn't even know that you need to have? So these are just a few of the things that I would want you to kind of think about. So you want to consider the timing. So not that there is ever necessarily a great time to have a difficult conversation, but on your way dropping off someone to a train to a train station, or kind of right before bed, are likely not the best times to have a conversation where there maybe a need or a little more time to process. So again, there may not ever be a perfect time, but is there a time that might be better than others? So maybe on the weekend when you are, not necessarily in work mode, or maybe you put something on the calendar to have this conversation with this person. So you do want to consider timing. You should also expect that there will be a little bit of defensiveness maybe and some pushback. So it's important to note that when we're talking about boundary setting or having some of these difficult conversations, the people who are most invested in us not having boundaries are going to be the people who are going to give us the most pushback. So if there is a friend in your life who, is always asking for something and you're always saying yes, and now you've done a little bit of assessment and you realize, okay, I don't want to say yes anymore or as much anymore, that first no is going to feel like you calling them out of their names, right? Because they're just not used to you hearing. They're just not used to hearing it from you. But that doesn't mean that you're going in the wrong direction or that you have done something wrong. It just means that they are going to now have to adjust to this new version of who you are. And so they are likely very invested in your yeses because it makes their life easier, right? So when you start saying no, there will likely be some pushback and some defensiveness. You should just go ahead and expect that. The other thing that you want to consider when you're having some of these conversations is that you need to get people to digest what you shared, right? So a lot of times when we know we're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody, we spend lots and lots of time thinking and rehearsing and, kind of figuring out what we're going to say. And then we have the conversation and we expect that person to just be able to kind of digest it immediately when we've likely spent at least a few weeks, kind of chewing it through. So it is important to make sure, depending on what it is, that you give this person time to digest whatever the information is and maybe set a time to come back and discuss it. And then you also want to remember that you cannot be super invested in the outcome and you can't control the outcome. So you can do as much as you can to make sure that your message is clear, that you've said exactly what you wanted to say, but we have no control over how people are going to hear what we have shared or how they're going to react. And so we have to just allow that process to unfold at that point. There's no way for you to kind of really be able to predict that. And I think that this is what stops a lot of people from having some difficult conversations that they know they need to have, is that they are worried about the outcome. They're worried about what the response is going to be. But no amount of worrying, no amount of practicing and rehearsing is going to allow you to control that person's response. How many times have you done this rehearsal in your head where you're like, okay, well, I'm going to say this and they're going to say that and then I'm going to say this, right? And then you go to have the conversation and it looks nothing like that, right? And so I think that is just a reminder for us that we can't be super invested in what the outcome or their response to the conversation is going to be. We are just responsible for us sharing how we're thinking and feeling. So a couple of examples of things that, might be happening in your life that you may want to initiate a difficult conversation about. So you learn some things about your partner that are not so pleasant, right? And so it is, again, very likely that this has come up for you, right? So we have been in close quarters, tensions have been high, there's been lots going on. And so it's very likely that you may have learned some things or seen some sides of your partner or roommate that you did not see before. So some things that you want to think about. So you want to, again, consider the context of the past couple of months. So when you think about, again, that list of stressors that we talked about in the beginning, there have been lots and lots going on. And so it's very likely that, whatever this thing is that you've learned about your partner is, you cannot separate that from the context of the multiple stressors that we've had. So definitely think about that. You also want to think about, is this going to be a deal breaker for you? So whatever this thing is that you've learned, maybe they are more messy than you even anticipated, or they're even less patient than you knew. Is this going to be a deal breaker for you? Because something that's going to be a deal breaker is definitely something that you're going to have a conversation about, as opposed to something that you're like, I would love for that to be different, but if it doesn't change, I'll be fine. So consider whether it's a deal breaker. And are you willing to talk with them about it? So it is one thing to kind of just recognize that something may be an issue for you, but it's a different thing to recognize that it's an issue and now you're going to have to say something about it. So if you are not willing to say something about it, then you don't want to spend too much time and energy kind of focusing on this thing, because nothing's going to change if you're not willing to say anything about it. So those are a couple of things to consider. A second example is, you haven't heard from a close friend in weeks and you're disappointed. And I saw a lot of this going around, especially when we first started sheltering in place. Lots of these memes about, this time will tell you who your real friends are. And if you haven't heard from somebody in the past couple of weeks, then they're probably not a good friend, right? And I don't think that is all that is at all fair. And so when we're thinking about how we can extend grace to others, we want to consider what else may be going on. And so one of the first things, if this is a situation that feels familiar to you, I would want you to do is to examine what is the story that you're telling yourself about why you haven't heard from them, right? So immediately, what is the go-to that you have in your mind about why you haven't heard from them? So is it about, oh my goodness, are they okay? Let me check in. Or is it more, they're mad at me, or they're not a good friend to me, right? And so sometimes it's important to think about the fact that extending grace really requires us to take ourselves out of the center of whatever this issue is. Might they be struggling right now, right? So again, thinking about all the layers of stress, that I shared, and tons more that are not even on that slide. Might they be struggling right now? And they might be the friend who is typically the one who reaches out, but they don't have the bandwidth right now. They may be really struggling. So what would it look like for you to actually reach out to them? And again, is this a deal breaker for you? Is the fact that you have not heard from them in a couple of weeks, and if you say, okay, this is a pattern that has repeated itself, and I think that that's important to pay attention to as well. If this is something that happened kind of recently, again, given all the stressors going on, I think that that's a very different conversation to have versus if this is somebody who kind of falls off the face of the earth, lots of times, even before we were sheltering in place. So if that's the case, then it sounds like you are overdue for a conversation just about how this person shows up in your life and whether that relationship is actually going to be reciprocal. But if that's not the case, and this is the first time that this has happened, then I think you do want to think about, is this kind of behavior a deal breaker for you? Just a few things to consider, again, when we're thinking about extending grace to other people. So some books that may be helpful for you related to this topic of extending grace to either yourself or to someone else. So Self-Compassion, you heard me mention earlier, is a book by Dr. Kristen Neff, and there's also a workbook that goes with it. So if it feels like that's something that you need to work on a little bit more, you need to be a little more kind and gentle with yourself, you might appreciate either the book or the workbook or both. I'd encourage you to check those out. The worry trick is another one. So we know that sometimes our stress gets really, really high because we're not able to manage our anxiety, which then makes it difficult for us to extend grace to ourselves and other people. And so the worry trick is a great book that includes lots and lots of tips and strategies for how to manage some of that kind of just garden variety anxiety a lot of us experience. The Gifts of Imperfection is by Dr. Brene Brown and is another great one to really talk about how you can really let go of some of that critical voice that you have and maybe some of these ideas about having to be perfect in our society. And related to that is a workbook called the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism. And so again, if you are somebody who likes more hands-on activities and worksheets and those kinds of things, then the two workbooks that I've mentioned may be really good ones for you to check out. So I would, of course, love to stay connected with you all. So you can find me across social media at Hello Dr. Joy. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can definitely feel free to visit my website at hellodrjoy.com. All right, so I am going to stop sharing my screen now and go back to our question and answer. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so it looks like I missed a very early question from Rita asking to give examples of microaggressions. And so Rita, one example or a couple of examples of microaggressions are when you hear people say things in the workplace like, oh, your presentation was so articulate, right? So I think when people say that, who knows what they really mean? But for somebody who has multiple college degrees and lots of trainings and certifications, it really kind of digs into like, well, what was your expectation of what I would sound like? So that is an example of a microaggression. Another example of a microaggression might be somebody making a comment about your hair. So my hair typically is in a big afro. But if I came into the workplace one day with my hair straight and all of a sudden you made a comment about like, oh, your hair looks so beautiful that way, right? So then my mind is thinking, well, what did you think about what my hair looked like before? So microaggressions are, sometimes seemingly small things that people will share. But again, cumulatively can really cut down on the mental health and really negatively impact the mental health of people. And again, we see this a lot in the workspace. All right, let's see. Asa is saying, I feel frustrated when something goes wrong, especially in this quarantine. How can I reduce this? So Ashib, I think that, really working on self-compassion and giving yourself more grace is actually perfect for you. So I think you'd likely benefit from checking out some of the additional resources that I mentioned, especially the self-compassion book and workbook. Because especially right now, like, again, so much is out of our control. And so when people struggle with like making mistakes or giving themselves grace, a lot of it is in an attempt to control. And we know that we just do not have control even over more than even we thought that we did, right? And so I think especially right now, you do have to remember that you are likely doing the very best that you can. Your resources may be limited, just in terms of your emotional bandwidth may be down. You may not be able to do some of the things that you really enjoy doing in terms of self-care, which of course makes it, again, more difficult for you to respond to yourself and others with kindness and grace. So, I think looking at how you might be able to do a better job of like increasing self-care if you can, and looking into some of those resources may be really helpful for you. Okay, Britt is saying, my best doesn't feel like my usual pre-pandemic best. Of course. How can I accept that this is my best right now and that that's okay? So, Britt, I think that that's a very similar question to the one Ashib just asked. Is just understanding that nobody's best looks the way that it did before, right? And so really kind of tapping into, okay, what were my expectations and how can I maybe make those expectations more realistic given what I know about where the world currently stands? So the idea of who you were and the reality of who you were is just a very different reality now. And so again, I think being kind to yourself, releasing and relaxing some of those expectations is going to be really important. And maybe even giving yourself daily reminders that you are doing the best that you can. And writing down on paper, like the things that you have achieved so that you can see. Because sometimes when we're not taking account of things, we don't necessarily know how much we're doing. When we see it on paper, then it's sometimes like, wow, even with all of this stuff going on, look at all of the different things that I've been able to accomplish. Okay, so Jenny is saying, what if my hubby has done nothing to interact with kids, just like a nobody at home? So Jenny, it sounds like that is one of those difficult conversations. So I'm not sure if you've not had this conversation with hubby, but I would encourage you to do so, right? And again, is it that he has literally done nothing, or is it that you have kind of been keeping account in your head and you're feeling like you've done much more than he has? But either way, it sounds like you're feeling resentful. You're likely feeling very tired and burned out. And it sounds like this is a call for help, right? You need something from him, or you need some additional resources and help. So I would encourage you to have the conversation with him about how you're feeling and to see if there are some changes, if there are some changes that might be able to be made that would give you a little bit of additional assistance. I know that, single parents, of course, have been struggling with a lot of this, but even in homes where there might be two parents or other adults involved, a lot of this has just been really, really difficult and has really just strained our ability to kind of support one another and our kids. And so if there are safe ways where you can maybe have relatives come and help with the kids, if they, have been quarantining themselves and you trust that they can safely be a part of your kind of hub, your quarantine hub at this point, then that may be something to think about. But it definitely sounds like there needs to be a conversation at the very least with your husband about how you're feeling. Trisha is saying, any extra hints for people like perfectionists who should all over themselves? So Trisha, it sounds like you have had some experience with that whole framework of shoulding on yourself, right? And so shoulding on yourself is this whole idea that if we think about our language, there are lots of things that we say we should be doing. Like, I should be a better parent, or I should be further along in my career, or I should be partnered by this age, and all of these things, right? And so one thing that can be really helpful for people who should on themselves is to really think about where those messages came from. So a lot of times when we have these ideas about what our life should look like at a certain point, or the things that should be happening in our reality, we can realize that those ideas are not ideas that we are particularly tied to, and they didn't ever really come from us, right? So these ideas that you need to be partnered and have kids by 30 and all of these things, who said that that is what your life has to look like, right? And so taking some steps back to think about, why am I even striving for this thing? And is this something that I really want? Can be a really helpful thing, a helpful exercise for you to practice. Okay. Can you offer suggestions or small steps to work through work stress and lack of productivity at work? I've been struggling with focus and motivation for weeks at work. So you are likely not alone, which is why you saw me use that as an example here. I think productivity has likely been down for lots and lots of people. Now, some people, when they are stressed, like to throw themselves into work. And so for a lot of people, this may have been a way to kind of like manage their anxiety. But if you are not one of those people, then that is totally okay. I would encourage you to have a conversation with your boss, to see if there are ways that, standards, again, can be relaxed right now. Is there a way that you can ask for any additional help right now? I think kind of getting ahead of it before it becomes a thing where, you've just missed a bunch of assignments or whatever, I think could be really helpful. But also just understanding, again, that these are very unprecedented times, as you hear people keep using. And again, there's no blueprint. There's no guidebook for how to survive a pandemic successfully. We all just are hoping to make it to the other side of this with a little bit of our sanity and our health intact. And so all of these concerns about productivity, I think we are really just putting more pressure on ourselves right now, because there are so many other things going on that we do have to be mindful of. But I think starting with having a conversation with your boss might be a good place to go. I work in an intense, fast-paced work environment and have been unfocused and making mistakes since the pandemic. My boss is completely not understanding. What recommendations do you have for coping in this predicament? He is threatening my job. So it is likely that his behavior is not making this any better. And again, I know that this is a very precarious time, but I would encourage you to be looking for other jobs, because it feels like this could kind of go either way. Because again, there is no amount of will we can muster. There is no magic wand. Like, if you are stressed and don't have the resources to be able to take care of certain responsibilities, then you're just not going to be able to do it, right? Again, we are in a pandemic. And so I think it is important for us to continue to remind ourselves of that. And it is unfortunate and sad that not all bosses are, understanding of that, and have these ideas about what productivity and stuff should still look like even right now. But I think it would be in your best interest to at least start looking for other ways that you might be able to support yourself, because again, the stress that he's putting you under is likely not making it more likely that you're going to, be able to produce any quicker. But for you and for the other question that we just had about productivity and like motivation. So some of that, of course, is a very normal, expected response to what has been going on, but it can also be a symptom of depression. And so if this is something that was going on even maybe before the pandemic, or if you feel like it has become so significant that it's not only impacting your work life, right? So maybe you are seeing difficulty with motivation and focus even in other areas of your life, then it might be good for you to talk with a therapist just about, what's going on. Are you really processing everything that's happening? Because sometimes when we are holding all of that stuff in, then it is more difficult to focus and process, or focus and be motivated, because we're holding on to all of our grief related to everything that's happening, holding on to our anxiety, lots of different things. So it may be good for you to talk with a therapist about how you're feeling. That may help you to unlock some of that difficulty with motivation as well. Oh, this is a good question. So where do you find the balance between giving yourself grace and complacency. And so I think that there is a balance. Those are not the same things, right? So grace is, I understand that I'm not always going to be the best at this thing, but I'm going to keep trying. Whereas complacency does not include the keep trying part, right? So complacency is like, oh, I'm just kind of going to resign that I'm not going to be good enough or whatever. Whereas giving yourself grace is, okay, this might be difficult, but I know it will pass and I'm going to keep trying. So I think that that's where the difference is. Okay, I've gotten burned out on overworking, COVID, and racial injustice. How do I get my energy back and practice more resilience? I feel so far from being able to bounce back and even doing the smallest tasks at work or around the house. So again, I think that that could be some depressive symptoms that you're talking about. And again, it can be really hard because so much of what is happening right now, of course, does result in a lack of motivation, and it can be difficult to focus, but you do have to be careful that it is not becoming maybe a depressive episode. And so I think if you are not able to get some support, then I would also encourage you to talk with a therapist if you can. And I'd also ask you to look at how forthcoming are you being with the people in your life about how you're feeling, right? So I know pre-pandemic, it was very normal for us to see someone and be like, oh, hey, how are you? And we just kind of say fine and keep moving. But a lot of us are not fine right now. And so are you being honest with people in your life about how you're actually feeling? Are you asking for help? So I know we likely have a lot of strong friends here joining us today, right? If you're the person who everybody goes to, the person that's always there to kind of solve other people's problems, it can be really hard for you to be the one to ask for help. But I think especially right now, it is important and critical for us to get comfortable asking for help. So I'd encourage you to look at those things. I would also encourage you to look at what kinds of self-care strategies you might need a little bit of a booster on. So are you continuing to get any physical activity? And it doesn't have to be high impact aerobics or, doing a whole bunch of stuff, but are you even getting like a 15 to 20 minute walk? Making sure that you can get outside for some sunshine, if you can do that safely, is a huge boost, or it can be a huge boost to your mood. And then paying attention to your sleep. So I know sleep is probably all over the place. Mine is. I'm sure a lot of yours is as well. But paying attention to your sleep. So are you, working on trying to get 6 to 8 hours of restorative sleep at night? Maybe making sure your phone is in a different room and making sure the temperature is, perfect for your house so that you can more likely sleep. So looking at some of your self-care practices may be really helpful. But I think talking with a therapist, if that's something that you can do, and understanding that a part of what you're experiencing is just a really, really normal reaction to, again, everything going on with COVID-19 and continuing to have to, manage any racial injustices. So Elizabeth is asking, can you provide insight on the comparison trap and why we do it and how we can combat it with self-compassion? Yeah, Elizabeth. So there's actually been lots of research that talks about how, and I specifically talk about social media because I really feel like that has kind of just accelerated all of this comparison that we sometimes do. But there's been lots of research that has talked about how you could be having a good experience, like say pre-pandemic, at a party, right? Like you're having a great experience hanging out with your friends, and then you scroll on Instagram and you see another set of friends, like maybe hanging out at a restaurant. And then all of a sudden, you don't necessarily feel as great about the party that you're attending, right? And so there is something that happens when we look at the experiences of others in terms of us projecting, like, oh, they're having a better time than we are. And so some of it is just really natural, right? Like I think we're human, and so it's natural for us to kind of want to know where we kind of line up in terms of the order to other people. But the danger comes when that becomes then how we think about ourselves, right? So it's not just like, oh, they're having a great time at a party and I'm having a great time at a party, but now it's, oh, they're having a better time than I am. And so then we start making all kinds of assumptions and calculations about ourselves that are not accurate. And so I think that is where it's important to really pay attention to the habits that you're having on social media. If there are a whole bunch of people that you follow that are aspirational, right? So you follow this one person because you feel like, oh, this is the perfect family like I would like to have, or this person has a body like I'm working toward, right? And it makes you actually feel worse about yourself then I think it is important to unfollow those people and to follow people who actually are more realistic to what your life is like now. So I think it's fine to kind of be inspired and want to work towards something. But if you are kind of constantly in relationship to these images that make you feel bad about yourself, then you're probably working against yourself. So it's a natural part, Elizabeth, of life. But I do think social media has really kind of accelerated that in a lot of different ways. Ellen is saying, how can you deal with so much death and illness all around us and still show up and perform at work? This is a good question, Ellen. And I in a lot of ways, feel like a lot of what we are being expected to do is unrealistic. Just quite honestly, because again, there is no blueprint for how do you survive a pandemic. And so a lot of what we're being asked to do is really kind of stretching ourselves beyond what is really acceptable for human capacity. And so we know that a lot of what has happened this year is us having a grief reaction. So there is a reaction to the loss of loved ones, the loss of people who we didn't know. There has just been a huge loss of life related to COVID-19 and other things happening. But we also know that we are grieving just the idea of what 2020 was supposed to be, right? So I know just the catchiness of 2020, right? 2020 vision. Lots of us had big ideas about what this year might look like, right? And so all of those things are not coming to pass. Lots of celebrations and gatherings and all kinds of things have had to be canceled because of, everything going on to COVID-19. And we are not even able to engage in our typical grieving rituals, right? So funerals don't even look the same ways. And so all of those things have been upended. And so we are really being forced to kind of, suspend reality in a lot of ways to just kind of keep plugging through. And so that is why, giving yourself grace and really tapping into yourself saying, this is really not sustainable. And pulling back in those moments when you can, I think is going to be really important, So I don't think expecting yourself to be at peak performance, given everything going on in the world, is actually anything to aim for. I think you do want to maintain your humanity in this as much as possible and really aim for, I'm doing the best that I can today. And that might look different tomorrow. Tomorrow I may look a little bit more productive, but for today, this is where I am, and really checking in with yourself about that every day. How do you deal with the newfound unfavorable things when they happened in the partner's past? For example, your significant other shares stories from years ago that changes the way that you view them. So I think that again warrants a conversation, because I think I would be wondering or be curious about what has changed for you? Like what about whatever they've shared changes your view of them? And is it really connected to something that's realistic, right? So it sounds like maybe you had this idea about who your partner was. They've now shared this story, and now it has changed some things for you, which is totally fine. But again, is that a deal breaker for you? And was that view that you were holding on to about who your partner was that realistic in the beginning, right? And where did it come from? So did it come from you kind of thinking about okay, this is the person that I'm with? And was that actually built on concrete evidence, or was it your story of who your partner was? So I would encourage you to kind of sit with all of that for yourself and try to make sense of okay, why am I so shocked by this? And why has this changed my idea about who my partner is? And then if you still are not able to kind of make sense of that for yourself and you feel okay, this is not just my own stuff, then I would encourage you to have a conversation with your partner about, now that you have this information, what does this mean for the relationship? And, are there some things that now need to be negotiated based on this new information? Okay, Rita is asking, can you give a little bit more information on the key concepts of cognitive behavioral therapy? Does it tie into mindfulness training? So yes and no, Rita. So cognitive behavioral therapy is really about thinking about how our thoughts impact our behavior. So if you have negative thoughts, then that can lead to negative behavior. Mindfulness training is more about being focused on what is happening in the moment. And so mindfulness is about not necessarily making a judgment about a thought, but just noticing that the thought exists. And so a lot of mindfulness is more about how do you ground yourself in the current reality? So when you hear us talk about things like grounding exercises, so things like looking around your environment and noticing 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can taste, and 1 thing that you can feel. Like those are grounding exercises that are designed to really ground you in the current moment. So it's not necessarily tied to cognitive behavioral therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy is just much more about the thoughts. All right, let's see. If everyone in your friend group relies on you for everything, how do you address them and ask them to take the pressure off of you? How do you step back from trying to save everyone and just be a friend? This is a really good question, and I think it often comes up. And so I think a lot of people are noticing now, especially that they are this person in the group. Maybe they didn't know that before, and now they can see this, that they are kind of the strong friend, the one that everybody expects to have all of the answers. And so if you notice that you are this person and you don't like it, or if you feel like you don't have capacity, then I think it is okay to be assertive and say, I would love to help you with that, but I don't have the bandwidth to do this. And just really think about how you can say no more. So it's not even necessarily about asking them to take the pressure off of you. Like, people are entitled to ask us for whatever it is they want. But we have to remember that we're also entitled to saying no to those things. We're also entitled to taking an assessment of our own energy and figuring out what we have the energy to kind of give to other people and what we have to keep for ourselves. So I'd encourage you to look at how you can say no more. All right, looks like we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So let's see. Stephanie is saying, when it comes to affirmations and checking receipts, I can end up still taking the perspective of my inner critic throughout the activity. Is there any way I can make these strategies more effective for me? So Stephanie, I think it's important. So it feels like your inner critic is even criticizing your ability to do these activities, which is, it happens, right? And so it is not necessarily a thing that is overnight, right? So if you think about the fact that you may have had some negative self-talk going on for maybe a majority of your life, you shouldn't expect that, doing this activity 2 or 3 times is going to change that. The idea is that you keep doing the activity so that it gets a little easier. So it may not ever be at 100%, but can you slow down some of that negative self-talk so that it is not as critical as it maybe was before? Okay, let's see. One final question. Okay, so the last question is, do you have more tips for letting go of the outcome for difficult conversations where people don't react well? It can be hard not to internalize that. That's a really good question. And so, I think if your reaction is to internalize what somebody says, it's very likely that you're doing that in other areas of your life, right? So if you are thinking about, okay, I can't have this difficult conversation because they're going to say something and that's going to mean that I'm a bad person or that I did something wrong, then it is likely that that is showing up in other areas of your life. And so I don't think that that is so much about like the conversation piece. That sounds like it's tapping into something a little bit different. It sounds like, there may be some like self work to do there, because something people say, like, people again are entitled to say whatever it is that they want to say. But if you are internalizing it and immediately making it feel like it's true, then it feels like there's a breakdown there somewhere that may require a little bit more work. So I would encourage you to maybe do some journaling. Like, when is the last time you've had a conversation? What was the message that you took away from that conversation? And is it really true? And maybe you can think through a couple of conversations that you've had, and are there any patterns that come up? So does this happen with certain people in particular? Is it across conversations? Are there other situations where this happens? I would encourage you to do a little bit of digging, because it feels like that isn't necessarily about not being connected to the income or the outcome. And it is more about, like you internalizing messages from other people as opposed to who you know yourself to be. All right, y'all. Well, we are out of time for today, but I do appreciate, there are tons of questions I could not get to. I apologize. But I really appreciate your engagement with the content today and showing up for the presentation and for yourselves to hopefully get some additional tips and skills. And I encourage you to check out all the other incredible presentations and mindfulness activities that we have here at Happify. Lots of great things for you to work on your personal development, especially if that is something that you're struggling with right now. Again, would love to be connected with you all across social media. So if that is your thing, then definitely connect with me there. If you need to follow up and send me a message, you can do that on the website as well. Take good care, and I will see you all again soon.